Hey everybody, quick little, I don't know how quick it'll be, a quick little bunker how to think video. And so I'm going to try to do more of these. It's going to come down to how fast I can produce them and get them up, because if it takes all day for me to make a video like this, it's not worth it. So what I generally try to do is, when I run into some major logic fallacy, social media for the most part is a logic fallacy factory. But when I run into one that's really a clear example, try to use it and use it to teach with. So let me say from the outset, smash the like button. Make sure you subscribe. But say from the outset, I don't have any animosity with anybody. None of this is a beef. I usually tell people, hey, in a joking, lighthearted manner, I'm going to use you as an example, and for the most part, I'm going to try to keep people anonymous. But this is just a lesson in how to think, and we should all encourage lessons in how to think. And so today I posted a post, and the actual original article was about microbes in the soil being an antidepressant, which is something that I've talked about for years. And I've advocated that people who have regular depression should work in the soil regularly, and they will find that, and there are scientific studies that show that it lifts depression and has a great impact on that. So I posted that article, and then I posted on it. And let me read it to you, because I want to get exactly, because I put qualifiers that are important to understanding it. Got to put on my eye crutches. Soil work is also one of the greatest immune system builders. People who never work in the dirt have compromised immune systems. I would love to see the virus infection rate for those who work regularly in the soil. And we're talking about COVID, right? The rate is near zero without it. And I bet it is functionally zero for anyone who is in regular contact with the dirt. Notice that there are two qualifiers. First, that it is functionally zero without working in the soil. So for everyone, the infection rate is less than 1%. And so my argument is that it would be less than that for people who are in regular contact with the soil. First response I got: sorry, Michael, all caps, wrong. My cousin who died from the virus was a keen garden. I think he means gardener, and sure didn't mind getting her hands dirty. I responded, I'm sorry about your cousin, but this is a perfect example of the anecdotal fallacy. So the anecdotal fallacy is a fallacy that says that if I can name one exception to a general rule or to a statement, even though he completely ignored that there were already qualifiers in there, so the exception wasn't even an exception. But if I can find one exception, then that destroys the argument. The easiest way to recognize the anecdotal fallacy is just to change the elements to something completely absurd and find out if there's a fallacy involved. Because when you stick with the original argument, there are emotions involved. Obviously, somebody brings up an anecdotal fallacy because there's somebody they're related to or something they experienced. They're tied to it. They have concluded in their mind something, considering that that's in their heart and not in their brain. And so if you change the elements of the argument, you can more easily notice if there's a fallacious response being made. So let's change the elements, and let's say that the death of, I'm going to make this up off the top of my head. The death by being stabbed to death by a narwhal, or narwhal, however you say it, is less than 1%. Okay. My argument is the death rate of being shot by a fiery arrow by a narwhal is going to be less than that. So, of course, you're on social media, so there's a billion people typing and looking, and you're going to find one person whose cousin was killed by a fiery arrow fired by a narwhal. And so they get on there and they're saying, wrong, you're wrong. My cousin was killed by a fiery arrow fired by a narwhal. No, not wrong. My argument was merely that fewer people most likely die who are in constant contact with the soil than those who are not from COVID, from the virus. Now, that's a slam dunk argument because we already know that the majority of the people who die are not only up in years. In America, particularly, most of them were in nursing homes. So they've had no contact with the soil. The argument's already won. The largest percentage of the people who have died from the virus have been people with comorbidity factors. Generally, age is a big one, and others. And just factually, a large percent, I think it's something like 42%. I could be wrong on that. Somebody could check me. Were people that were in nursing homes. It is a slam dunk to say that fewer people than that died who are regularly in the soil, because if you are regularly in the soil, most likely you are in better shape. Most likely you are. I'm talking about the vast majority of the people. You are active. You are in better shape. You are probably younger. There are probably more people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s working in the soil than there are people in their 90s. So the argument itself was a slam dunk. And really, if somebody wanted to come back, they could say, well, with the qualifiers you put on there, of course. So this particular argument is called an anecdotal fallacy. And I want people to learn how to recognize it, even amongst themselves. Because something happened to you, or you know an example of something, does not negate the general principle or the general law or the general facts or the scientific statistics. Okay. So what you have to do, and here's probably what happened. The guy who wrote this is a good guy. He's somebody I like. We probably don't agree on a lot politically, but somebody I like and I engage with. He didn't hear what I said. He most likely heard, because I put functionally zero. You don't put a qualifier if you mean zero. You understand? So if I had said zero, then his argument would be valid. But when I say functionally zero, that means as close to zero as you can really get without it being zero, which means there has to absolutely have been at least one death, or else it would be zero. Everybody following me? So my posit allowed for his cousin. If he could name a whole bunch more, it would strengthen his argument, but his argument would still be fallacious. It would still be anecdotal. All right, so dismissing that one, the second objection I got, another friend who I probably agree with more, and he did it through private message because he was trying to point out the fact that he didn't like people doing what the other guy did, which is jumping in on a thread and making it personal about them rather than about that's not a bomb, that was my other camera coming on, rather than about the facts that I mentioned and the qualifiers that I mentioned. In other words, read carefully. His objection was, and on its face, it makes sense, was that and I'm not going to read it exactly, but in fact, I probably should. I'm just going to read it to you. That way I don't misstate what he said. And I'm not attacking anybody. He's a good friend of mine. We talked since this. What you're saying didn't help the Native Americans, and they lived damn close to the dirt in 1492 when the Mayflower discovered Columbus. That was his way of selling a joke. So the general argument is that if it was true that you were being close to the soil made you less likely to contract a virus, then why did the Native Americans who worked closer to the soil than the Pilgrims suffer so much from disease being imported from the New World? Well, let me point out the errors in this argument. First of all, it's just not true. I would recommend, and I'll try to post this. I'll pop up something on here if I can figure out how to do it. There's a book by Nick Bunker, unrelated. He's not part of the Bunker Nation that I know of, Never met the guy. I don't know him, but it's a great book. And it's the title of the book is, because I sent it to this guy, Making Haste from Babylon, The Mayflower Pilgrims by Nick Bunker. And it's a new study of the conditions before and after the arrival of the pilgrims. The fact is that almost the entire eastern seaboard, especially the northern part, had been depopulated in less than 5 years before the Mayflower Pilgrims landed. A massive pandemic had gone through the whole eastern seaboard. The area where the pilgrims landed was occupied by more than 25,000 indigenous peoples who almost all perished prior to the arrival of the pilgrims. Now, there are arguments made in this book and elsewhere, and whether you believe in God or whatever, that somehow this was the argument was made by the pilgrims and the Puritans that this was God clearing the way for Europeans to populate North America. That can be as offensive as you want it to be, whatever. I'm quoting from a book, and so from memory. Um, And so, but the point is that a pandemic went through there, and they know this because they found entire villages that had been abandoned and or burned. They found corn still buried where they would bury their corn as a way of preservation in containers in hills. And there were clues throughout the area that there was just massive death. There just weren't enough people even to bury the bodies. There weren't enough people to carry away the food that was left, right? And so the entire eastern seaboard, several miles in from the ocean, had been depopulated. Now, the question is, now you might think, well, this supports his theory. These people worked in the soil. The actuality is that the people had changed their means of and manner of living. In many ways, they had become more industrialized. Not industrial revolution per se. This was in the 1600s. But they had changed their more agrarian, more transient way of living, and had grouped into larger people groups. That's why there were so many on the eastern seaboard. Because of that, many of the indigenous tribes were living more by warfare, living more by pillage against one another, and fewer people were producing more and more of the food. One of the reasons that the indigenous peoples that were there that helped the pilgrims in their planting and all of that was because they had become more adept at it because they were growing more food for fewer people. So there were actually fewer and fewer people amongst the indigenous people that were working the soil, and more of them were fur trapping for the French and all different types of things. And so you had people you had indigenous warriors were a larger and larger percentage of the people. There was constant battles, and so the book goes through a lot of this. So what we're actually seeing is that the indigenous people had become less connected to the soil, which is one of the reasons that a pandemic before the Mayflower ever landed killed so many. Okay, no doubt the pilgrims coming from originally Western Europe had become urbanized, and because of that, they themselves had become carriers of any number of diseases. They had themselves become separated from the soil. They had themselves very few skills when it came to growing things, which is why most of them died. All right. So they became carriers of disease. And when they did land, more of them died than of the indigenous peoples, but they were carrying diseases that became lethal for the Native Americans. So the argument doesn't hold water because it doesn't go back far enough. My argument is people, individuals who are more actively involved in the soil regularly are going to have heightened immune systems that are more likely to make them resistant to infection by the virus. If somebody has an argument against that, I would like to hear it, but I just want you to hear what I'm saying in the qualifications that I put in the original post. And as far as the argument about the American Indians, I don't have a problem with it. It's just that he just didn't have enough information. Now we do. So I'm going to try to do more of these posts. And again, it doesn't mean I'm right. I try to point this out a lot. Just because somebody else makes a fallacious argument doesn't mean that I'm right. I think that I'm right, but it doesn't mean that I'm right. We need to learn to think critically using reason, understanding logic fallacies, and that's what I'm here to help you guys do. I hope you enjoyed this. If you do, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. I'm going to try to do more and more of these. If you find them helpful, then like and subscribe. I appreciate it.